Hi there. I've got a really important idea to share with you, and you're not going to like it. Whether you're a scientist, philosopher, mathematician, or a person that thinks, you won't like knowing that it's impossible to be right. It goes against long-held beliefs, but it has to be said. It's the key to intelligence, and therefore artificial intelligence, and this key opens the gateway to peace on Earth. It's time for humanity to awaken. And while this may seem outrageous or just flat out crazy, please stick with me to the end and try and see things from a new perspective. You won't believe the possibilities that it opens up. So, first thing that I normally hear is when I say it's impossible to be right, people say, well, I know that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Well, what does 1 mean? How much is one lollipop plus kangaroo? Or in computer science, 1 plus 1 is 11 if they're string data types. And then my favorite, the Principia Mathematica, a book written a century ago that spent hundreds of pages trying to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2. And it got so confusing that people can't even interpret it, let alone misinterpret it. And that's the whole point, that right can be interpreted from different points of view, from different contexts. Like science could say, hey, there's an absolute cold but not an absolute hot. We have 0 degrees Kelvin, but things can only get, there's no bound to heat. But vacuum can't get hot. We need context. And in terms of water, it can only get so hot, 100 degrees Celsius. But of course, I can't be right about that. People are going to say, well, then it turns into steam. And this game goes on and on and on. There's always a different way to perceive things and make it correct from an alternate context. And if it's impossible to be right, then it's impossible to prove anything absolutely. But mathematicians are going to point to the crown jewel of mathematics among countless other proofs that establish that they are absolutely right and sure about the relationships. You can see here that the Pythagorean theorem, the crown jewel of mathematics, when it's quantized, turned into bits, in order to establish what does 1 mean in the context of 1, it's necessary for A and B to overlap to establish this unit. And you can see that the only way to get these to line up on graph paper, or quantized, is to sacrifice a cathet, or an edge to the square on each of them, which means that A and B are not technically perfect squares. This becomes more pronounced when we're smaller. We have a 2 by 3 rectangle. But mathematics takes things to the extreme when they establish proofs. And when things get really large, that missing cathet might as well be so negligible that it doesn't exist. But in the real world, when we have context, it isn't impossible to be right. There is a different perspective for the squares themselves. And it shouldn't take much convincing that you can't absolutely prove anything in a court of law. We've put enough wrong people behind bars to know that, which brings up the next point. Why should our world be based upon rights when it's impossible to be right? We have a Bill of Rights, but why not a Bill of Wrongs? A country couldn't exist if they stood on something like this, by the way. The problem is with righteousness, this has been our infection throughout the millennia, is that it gives people the permission to create any mistake that gets in their way. So, authority, they essentially become hypocrites at one point or another. And this is the one thing that nobody will ever say, but there's always another case, of course, that hypocrisy is acceptable. It's the one thing that when we base our world upon mistake avoidance, it's the contradictions, the hypocrisy that we want to avoid. We want to approach flawless, mistakeless, not be based upon rights. And this brings up a really interesting thing. If I say that it's impossible to be right, then that very statement can't be right, or else I would be a hypocrite. So it must be possible to be right. So what we have to embrace duality, something that quantum physicists have discovered that exists in all things. But then the question is, how do we tame the disarray? If we say it's impossible to be right and it's possible, what are we supposed to do with that? That makes no sense. So what we do is we separate it into two realms. In the moment when things are singular in our minds, it's impossible to be wrong. We always make the right decision. We can't help it. And this is why it's so hard to believe that it's impossible to be right, because we know that we are. With every moment in time, even if we're right about being unsure about something, in every fleeting moment of time, we are correct. But once that idea is turned into tangible memories, the imagination becomes a tangible memory. It's inverted and subject to duality. And in this realm, it's impossible to be right. All tangible memories, whether they're words on paper or concepts. And this brings up something else. If we're always right, that means that we're perfect. We decide perfectly, and only God is perfect. Well, this says something about that God must exist then. Everyone is right in the moment, and you may not like that because from your perspective, that person obviously did a wrong decision. But if you were in their shoes, you would have made the same exact decision if you had their life experiences, their DNA, and their context. And this must mean if we're God, the one and only, each one of us takes a turn, then reality must be an illusion. But it's also not. It's real if we believe it is. It might as well be real. Life, if we're God, then how can all these horrible things be happening? Life isn't fair. Well, you can say also it is fair. It's subject to duality. I'm the kid losing my limbs to landmines, and I'm also the guy placing them there. So how to fix our broken world? I mean, we have cancer. We're hurting each other, and this needs to stop. So we can do this by stopping the righteousness and embracing mistake avoidance. And there is an algorithm or a protocol that will help us figure this out and collectively find the pathway through, which is not wrong. It's called the intelligence algorithm, and you can see how it works here on this website, www.hipi.tech. It stands for the Human Intelligence Protocol Interface. It's based upon starting out with things true by default. And so for the first time in human history, it has become possible to know who is not wrong in a debate, which is really incredible. It's profound if you think about it. On the 5 o'clock news, people argue and never convince the other side of their point of view. Or on blogs, people argue and there's no metric, no way to determine the outcome of who is not wrong about a debate. So things start out true by default because they're closest to the imagination that conceives them, where they are right. So when they turn into tangible memories, we give them the benefit of the doubt, which is the way that trusting toddlers come into this world. They believe everything that they're first told. But if you want to take down a belief, you need to use a contradiction. And contradictions are also true by default, but they're comprised of dual polarity, like a plus and minus battery electricity. So contradictions are destructive, and this is what the HiPi is built upon. It's a language technique for invalidating your opponent's point of view and letting you know that for the first time being able to get a positive, definitive outcome for every debate. And I should just quickly mention if we say, okay, well, things are false by default, then the problem is, how do you ever get out of it? It's like a black hole that you can't escape. Where does right come from if it doesn't start out that way? So we can use this for miraculous things, how to fix a broken home. I'll go into other videos that describe this, but like Liberty Kids that are allowed to do anything they want. It's true by default. They can do what they want by default unless they do a mistake. And using this protocol is so incredibly effective at changing people's minds that I just can't wait to share some of this stuff with you. The idea is to mistake-proof those that are around us, to convince them using our words instead of our authority. Too often we say, you can't do that, and we don't say why, because I said so. Well, that type of stuff has got to end. And there's software to help out with that now. And so what's next that I'll be sharing with you? This impossible to be right is the seed that just it has tentacles that touch an endless amount of other things. I'll expose duality in all manners of abstract thought, and demonstrate that there's a universal mistake in every tangible memory, concept, proof, and cycle. Part of it is what I showed you with that overlapping a squared and b squared. There's a little error inside of every tangible memory. And use intelligence to explain how our existence works. How does the theory of everything? And it sounds outrageous, I know, but if we use this framework, people will be very surprised to learn that I've got some ideas that cannot be taken down. And I can do the same, playing by the same rules to alternative points of view. So I'm coming on here to YouTube because I need help. I need to find people to tell me why I'm wrong, but give me a chance to respond. It could be on the high pi, it can be in the comments of YouTube, on some of the Medium articles that I've written. I need to find people who are courageous enough to debate me. And I say courageous because it hurts to have these beliefs and have somebody contradict you, plain out in the open, using can't because. It is so effective at pinpointing the flaw in someone else's beliefs or way of thinking that it hurts, just like touching a hot frying pan, or anytime that you recognize you're wrong, it doesn't feel good. And what I've faced over the past 6 years is, with these ideas, is people that just run away. They don't want to get into it. I show them why they're wrong, and they disappear. So anyways, thank you for listening, and please watch for more videos to come.